this was the example of looking at the problem, a serious problem, from the shop floor upward. Our next speaker has had, on multiple occasions, the opportunity to look at merger and acquisition impacts and remediating actions, looking from the top down, from the IT space. So the next speaker is Adam Fridstrom. He's an enterprise architect with now the Dow DuPont company, and he's spent 27 years in Dow. He actually spent some time on the factory floor. So I mean, that may be a little bit of a clue to his approach. He has some experience on the shop floor, but his role is directly in the IT organization, and he does, from an architectural perspective, interface with the OT organization within Dow DuPont. Now, obviously, using the words Dow DuPont, Dow has gone through some, not as many mergers and acquisitions as Ashland did, but they've been mega mergers. And the complexity, now you're going to look at the complexity based on size versus quantity. Okay, so I'd like to invite Adam up here, and let's look at the problem from the IT looking down. Okay, Adam Fridstrom. Good job.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Mike, for inviting me to speak here, and thanks to ARC for hosting this forum. This has been a very beneficial event for me in the past several years. I've gained a lot of insight and a lot of industry knowledge from this event. So hopefully something I share here will be valuable to folks. So Dow has recently been through a merger with DuPont, and the announcement for this merger came on the same day as the announcement of Dow Chemical restructuring the joint venture with Dow Corning. So even though this shows two great companies combining into one, I really view this as really was a merger of three companies with Dow Corning, DuPont, and Dow Chemical, and the complexities associated with bringing all that together are some of what I'll talk a little bit about that, but also talk a little bit about some of the history of acquisitions that led us kind of to this point, prepared us to be able to actually pull off a deal of this size. So the idea is to split off into three separate, very focused companies, and the kind of scope of those three companies, there'll be an ag company, a material science company, and a specialty products company. And actually, since I had submitted these slides, Dow DuPont had announced year-end earnings of just a little bit shy of $80 billion. And they announced the separation of the material science company is going to be in the first quarter of 2019. And the separation of ag and specialty products is expected to happen by June 1st of 2019. So we're right in the middle of figuring out how to integrate the pieces that get integrated and separate the pieces that need to be separated. And Gary did a fantastic job of talking about some of the detailed complexities, especially in the OT space, of all of the things that have to be thought through to be able to make that successful. This is just a sampling of some of the bigger mergers and acquisitions in Dow's history. Interestingly, the Dow Corning joint venture was created back in 1943, and so Dow's had a pretty long history with this. It was probably probably our most successful JV ever. And so this is sort of the culmination of ending that journey and bringing them back into the fold. But in the 90s, there was a lot of work to try and to build an agricultural chemical presence inside of Dow. And there was a divestiture of our Dow brand, so all of our Ziploc and those types of things we divested back in the 90s. And of course, in Dow, the pendulum swings back and forth every few years. It seemed we'd want to focus on our commodity chemicals, and then we say, no, we need to diversify, and then they go the other way. And so there was always a lot of kind of portfolio shuffling going on, depending on who the CEO was and what their strategy was for that point in time. But we got more focused, I would say, since 2001, I think, and the strategies have been more consistent. And so in 2001, the Union Carbide acquisition was the first really big acquisition I was involved in. And then we followed that up with a Roman Haas acquisition. I list the K-Dow JV in here primarily because that deal, although it never was completed, we actually executed the IT project, and we were ready to separate that. We were within just a few days of going live with that when the deal was canceled. So what we learned from that project really shaped how we do M&As, since then. We've divested all the styrene-based products in Trinseo. And then the Sadara joint venture, which was mentioned, that facility has been started up within the last year or so. And then Dow Corning and Dow DuPont. So when we think about the priorities and the focus with respect to these M&As, the first one, obviously, is you need to be able to satisfy the regulatory requirements and get all the regulatory approvals. But from an IT perspective, consolidated financial reporting is kind of the first thing that we have to go after and try and figure out how to bring together the finances so we can get adequate financial reporting. Then in meeting the stockholder expectations while doing that, because there's commitments to delivering value and delivering on a specific timeline. So in the context of all of that, somehow we also need to keep our plants running. And so that's what I'm going to focus on is what's it mean to do no harm when you're in the middle of all this chaos of churn that's going on as you merge or try and separate companies. And so the recipe that I'm going to suggest and what we loosely follow is that we do a blueprint of the business processes, both Dow and whoever we're acquiring, or if it's a divestiture, looking at what the future needs of. Then and talk a little bit about planning for the complex integration, and talk a little bit about it was alluded to earlier, is the proliferation of all of these tools that are one-off solutions that have grown up in other companies. And you accumulate these things over time, and you have to have a strategy for what to do with those things. And then talk a little bit about the IT/OT implications and challenges. So the blueprinting of the business process, I say we start with that because in Dow, our strategy is to harmonize our ERP systems. And in order to bring a new company in, we have to understand what are the differences in business process. And in some of the other functions, it's a little bit easier because you can look at it at an enterprise level and get a feel for the processes and do the harmonization at that level. In manufacturing, though, you really have to go visit the plants. You have to understand what's really going on at the shop floor level. If you don't understand the business process at that level, you're going to create huge problems when you try to harmonize even the ERP systems, let alone try to harmonize any sort of integration that's happening at the MES layer. So doing a gap assessment against your current capabilities, understanding what those gaps are that need to be closed, and identifying upfront what are the areas that are of high complexity that need to be dealt with, and I'll get into some examples of high complexity that we've had to deal with. on the next slide. And then, around that, you have to build a plan to execute against all these gaps and do it in a way that you minimize the impact on operations. Yeah, when I look back at Union Carbide and the Roman Haas acquisitions, those companies had less integration. They really didn't have any integration with their MES systems, and in some cases didn't have MES systems at all. So it was primarily an ERP migration, and that has its own challenges in that you've still got to harmonize business processes, and you've got to understand how all the accounting is being done and rolled up from the shop floor. There's no integration with an MES system. It's all manual, and so you have to account for that. Dow's approach has been, basically to bring the other company into our system. DuPont, interestingly enough, has a little bit different strategy and a little more independence in their business units, and they operate in multiple ERP systems. I have seen evidence that approach gets very complicated and unwieldy, and so I'm not sure I recommend that approach. But Dow's generally been successful in doing the harmonization into a single ERP. So we have a single SAP instance of ECC that runs the whole company, and we try to standardize as much as we can on the business processes cross-functionally, and then we look at the gaps with the new company against our current design and figure out how to get that company into our system, and then how to train those people on how to work within our business processes in our system. What we learned with the Dow Corning acquisition or merger was the amount of extra effort that goes in when you have a high level of integration with the shop floor. And I was involved very early in the integration of Dow Corning. And visiting the first plant, I knew we were in trouble because the way that Dow Chemical kind of looks at how we do planning and performance management around an asset, you think of asset utilization in terms of how many pounds of stuff can I push through the hardware. And when I looked at some of the facilities that Dow Corning was running, they're looking at scheduling a space of floor where they bring equipment in and they make a product in a kettle and put it into some sort of package, and then when that's done, they wheel that out and they go find some different equipment and bring it in. And so it's a massive effort of planning and scheduling equipment and floor space and people to all be on hand with all the right material. So the optimization in that business was more focused on the planning, scheduling, and I would say the ERP side of the execution of orders than it was optimizing the control system and how many pounds of stuff that you could get through the hardware. And so that realization, caused us to step back and say, well, we can't just force them onto our system and into our processes, or we will break the business. So that when we talk about complexity and integration, there's a need to really understand the business model that's driving success for the other company and see how close and how possible is it to harmonize our business processes based on the business model and the operating model. And so what we embarked on then was a project to identify. Basically what we did was migrated the MES environment across, but we had to reconnect all of the interfaces to Dow's ERP system, and had to go in and define all of the places that were connecting with SAP, understanding the protocols that were involved, and figuring out how to migrate all of that over. And in addition to that, they had data stores that were pulling information from their ERP system and using it in their MES environment. And we had to figure out, do we populate those data stores? Do we need to provide a source of information somewhere else? And if so, then we need new interfaces. And so there's a lot of complexity around keeping that MES environment running as you do the transition from one ERP to the other. And then there's a whole other type of integration, and that's integration in the chemical processes themselves. And this is one that has been extremely challenging, not from an integration like an acquisition standpoint, but more from divestitures. Dow, for probably the first 100 years of its existence, really invested in optimizing, integration at large chemical sites. And so you've got, a large number of plants with pipes and product and byproduct and utilities and all of that stuff all being leveraged across a large number of plants at a facility. And a couple of years ago, we decided we're going to sell the chlorine business, and we carved out chlorine, but chlorine was the foundation for all of that integration. And so we had literally hundreds of flows that were not metered that had to be accounted for, that were going to go back and forth between Dow and the company that we were selling these assets to. And some of the assets even had shared control rooms, and shared servers, and we had to figure out how to split MES systems and put walls in control rooms. And so a huge amount of complexity resulting from a strategy that over 100 years had evolved into high level of integration from end to end, at a site, to figuring out how do you carve that out and manage that integration with another company being involved, and how do you do that and not lose the efficiency of what you had built up over time. The other thing I think is critically important, and Gary touched on it in his presentation, but with the number of acquisitions and mergers and small companies that we've acquired over time, we've inherited a lot of solutions that are one-off. Oftentimes they're built locally, or they're purchased from a local vendor. And so every time we do one of these acquisitions, we accumulate more and more of this portfolio of applications that need to be either supported or figure out how to shut them down and replace them with something else. And when we looked at the portfolio of solutions that Dow Corning had, Dow's typical approach to an acquisition is we bring that company onto our processes, use our tools, and get rid of all their stuff. But what we discovered as we were evaluating Dow Corning is there was like, well, that stuff's way better than what we have. Why would we get rid of it? So then we had to go through a process of, like you said, figuring out who's got the best stuff, and let's pick the best one and try and harmonize that. But that has significantly complicated the footprint that we now have to deal with in terms of our manufacturing applications. So it's really important to have very aggressive management of your application portfolio and very aggressive management of technical debt. As that accumulates through mergers and acquisitions, you have to have a point where you can deal with those applications. We also have a number of legacy applications are incredible pain as well. The legacy control system that Dow had developed back 40 years ago, we still have remnants of that, and every time we carve out a business that has that technology, it's VMS process-based operating system, and not very many companies have that skill set handy. Plus, it was proprietary control system, and so no other companies have that skill set. And so we would have to provide, some sort of transitional support agreements to go along with that hardware. Very, very complicated. So the lifecycle management around your application portfolio is critical. It just adds cost and complexity to these transactions, and has an impact on the value that you can create in the process of doing an acquisition. And then the last one is the organizational piece, and this has been touched on a number of times, and Gary did a good job of talking to some of the interesting complexities here, but no two companies seems to have the same way of dividing up responsibility between IT and OT. Dow also has separate IT and manufacturing IT organizations, and so this was an interesting challenge with Dow Corning as well. Dow Corning had a manufacturing automation organization that was cross-functional, and it did a lot of the IT support, the servers, the networks, the process control, and all the MES support. Whereas in Dow, we probably had 6 or 7 different groups that managed all of that space. And when it came time to figure out, who has the skills to support what application, and who owns which application, and who owns the server stack, and who's going to support the server stack, those things really became complicated. And there were a lot of scenarios where we had servers in Dow's landscape would be supported by the IT organization, because they were sitting in a certain data center, but in Dow Corning's organization, it was supported by their manufacturing automation group. And there were a number of cases where we had to go back and have discussions. Okay, who's going to support this? Who's going to own this? And identifying ownership was a painful process. And getting the right resources retained to support all those different pieces was also interesting, because of the disconnect. Sometimes the organization that needed a resource didn't know that they needed that resource. And so as you do the reshuffling of the people in an organization, very easy to lose sight of some key people that are supporting mission critical applications. And so the land of confusion in the middle there is all of that complex space. So the servers, the networks, the security, the firewalls, your MES environment, and understanding where the lines are drawn in your own company and in the company that you're acquiring, and making sure that you identify the resources that are supporting those mission critical applications, so that you don't lose those skills in the process of doing the merger. So in summary, no two acquisitions are the same for sure. The blueprinting of the business processes, I recommend that as a starting place, so that you can understand how to harmonize companies. And as best you can, you need to do some reconnaissance and understand where are the areas of high complexity, and start work on those things as early as possible. As you uncover, as you turn over rocks, you just keep finding more and more stuff that needs to be dealt with. And if you don't start early, you're going to run out of time. And then I would say actively manage your application portfolio, especially as you acquire non-standard solutions, as with other companies. Having a plan to rationalize those things as a part of your integration efforts is probably the best way to deal with those things, because if you allow some of those solutions to hang around after the after the integration is completed. They're very difficult to get rid of. And then, clarifying your organizational boundaries. And I think I came pretty close to on time. So, thank you.